Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film a recent reads video. And these are books that I've read. I think even the first one is from the last book I read in the month of May, and the rest of these I've read in the month of June, and I realized that I have not talked about any of these yet, or if I've talked about it, I've only mentioned them in a vlog or something like that, and I haven't fully wrapped them up. So let's just get to it because I have quite a few books to get through. So the first book is a book that I started a while ago and finished it up, I think, on the last day of May. This is Stephen King's If It Bleeds, which is his story collection. And it is billed as a short story collection. But there is at least one story in here that is 187 pages. And so I don't know about you, but that to me is not a short story. That is at least a novella, if not a short novel. So I really enjoyed this collection of stories. I think Stephen King really shines in the short story novella length type format. He tends to, when he writes full-length novels, especially in his later years, like, he doesn't get edited very heavily, and so sometimes those longer novels can drag in the middle or whatever. And of course, with the shorter fiction, that tends to not happen as much. But I really like in the short fiction that was in this collection, how he explores some of the issues in our modern day world and how those issues impact us. And really, they're really reflective of a life and what you choose to do with that life and how that impacts the people around you and things like that. I really enjoy how he explores those kind of themes. And of course, you know, I love his characters. I just think he does character work just so well. I will say the really long story is called If It Bleeds. It's the titular story in the collection. And I'm not sure that it would work for everyone because it is a story from a reoccurring character in some of his longer novels. And I'm not sure you would fully get, you probably would enjoy the story, but you wouldn't fully get everything that's being referred to or alluded to in the story. So it is a story of Holly, can't think of her last name, but she is the main character in the book The Outsider, and she is a secondary character in the trilogy, the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, which are sort of detective stories, and this is another detective story, and Holly is a fantastic character. I love her so much. I love The Outsider. I love the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. So I was really glad to have this 187-page novella in this collection, but I'm not sure that it would work for a more casual Stephen King reader who hasn't already read those other books. So just buyer beware on that one. But otherwise, the 4 pieces of fiction that are in here, I think, are very well done. I was really pleased with that collection. I then read a piece of nonfiction. This is 1776 by David Mccullough. This was supposed to have been a buddy read with my nonfiction buddy read group, which is Karen at Run Right Reads, Patrice Jones, and Doris from Aldi Books. They all decided that they weren't interested in reading this book at this time, but I just decided to keep going with it. And I will say this is not my favorite David Mccullough book. I really like how David Mccullough writes about history, but this is specifically about the year 1776 during the American Revolution. And it is just a lot of battle scenes and sort of military maneuvering and strategy and how that works and doesn't work, and what the British were doing and what the Americans were doing, and where people were being placed and where they weren't being placed. So that could get a little tedious at times, but I do think David Mccullough really brings historical figures to life. And so I kept reading because I was really fascinated by these different men that are discussed in here, these different military leaders, these different generals. George Washington does not come off super great in this book. He made a lot of, in hindsight, poor decisions during the course of this year, but there was a lot of things that Mccullough points out that had they gone a slightly different way, the whole American experiment probably would have turned out a lot differently. And so there's some weird decisions that British generals make that completely changed the course of history. So I found that really fascinating, and I am glad that I read it, even if it isn't my favorite McCullough book. I will warn you, though, if you are just eyes glazed over with boredom about troop maneuvers and military strategy, like, this book is probably not for you. So, and then the next thing I completed was The Ungrateful Refugee, What Immigrants Never Tell You by Dina Nayeri, and this is supposedly a memoir. Dina Nayeri is an immigrant. She was a refugee, from Iran after the revolution. She fled the country with her mother and her brother when she was a young child. So we do get her story. It's not told in a linear way. There's a lot of back and forth in the timeline. There was some sections that are her discussions or interviews of other refugees later on in her life, that she goes to refugee camps and has these conversations with these other refugees and sort of details their experiences. Sometimes it was hard to place when these things were happening, whether they were happening in Dina's own timeline, in her own story, or whether they were happening in some other timeline. So I found that really frustrating. But the biggest thing I found frustrating about this book was that even though it's supposed to be a memoir, like, there's very little self-reflection in this book. Now, I don't like a lot of navel gazing. You guys know that about me. But I would like to know why you're making the decisions that you're making, or how something that happened to you has impacted you in your life. And you can't have that without some discussion of your feelings, or how something made you feel, or why, your explanation of why you made certain decisions. And so there's none of that in here. There is no self-reflection whatsoever. Like, there's a lot of factual telling, like, this happened and this is what my mother did, or this is what my father did, or this was the choice that was made, or I married this person and then I divorced this person. But there's no, like, why did you do that? Why did you make that choice? Or how did that make you feel? And so I found it really frustrating. I could not feel I couldn't connect at all to this memoir. I found it interesting in places. I found it enlightening in places. I think that the refugee story is extremely important, obviously, to be told. I'm glad that some of these stories are being told. I think it's important that we all understand what people go through when they're trying to find safe places to live. All of that is good. And there are sections in here where she's just describing the process of being a refugee and what that process is like in different countries. And I thought that was really interesting information to have, and I was glad to have read that. But as far as, like, being a memoir, this is a big failure for me. And I was buddy reading this with Britta Bowler. And I think if I hadn't been buddy reading it, I might have just given up on it, because I was so frustrated with, first of all, I couldn't keep track of whose story was being told when and what time we were in at any given time. And then the lack of self-reflection was just frustrating to me. If this had been a straight work of nonfiction where we're discussing refugee policies and how it works for refugees, well, that's one thing, but it's supposed to be her story too. And so I expect more about her specifically. So yeah, this was not a success for me. Then I finished another book in my presidential reading challenge. This is the second book that I've finished for McKinley. This is The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Tara, and Empire at the Dawn of the American Century by Scott Miller. This is an excellent example of how a presidential biography should be written, in my opinion. This was extremely readable, really engaging, really held my interest. I flew through this book, which is a big chunky biography, which is not something that you could usually say. I would say this is written more in the vein of an Erik Larson book, as opposed to like a true scholarly academic biography. And I love that. I'm here for that. I wish every president had a book like this. And so this tells the story of President McKinley in two timelines. Basically, his timeline and the timeline or the history of his assassin. And so you flip back and forth between those two narratives. And the assassin timeline was really interesting because it discusses the rise of the anarchy movement in the United States and how that impacted American labor movements and things like policing, and how how we think about terrorism. I mean, this was all like the beginning stages of all of that. And so I found that extremely fascinating. And then President McKinley, we start the book with his assassination right at the very beginning. And then we go back in time and we sort of discuss what it was about President McKinley that got him elected to be president. And then some of the stuff about his presidency. Mostly what this goes into is American imperialism and how McKinley was the first president to undertake to, what's the word that I want to use, to colonize and to just basically take over other countries in the name of America and in the name of American interests. So this book talks about Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, all these places, Guam, that were the beginnings of American imperialism. And I found that really fascinating. And discussing that piece and how it plays into the American labor movement and the economy of America, I thought was really, really well done. So if you're looking for a presidential biography, I would definitely recommend this one. If you're looking for information about America at the turn of the 20th century, this is a fantastic book. Like, there's just so much to recommend about this one, and I loved it. I also read On Juneteenth. I actually read On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon Reed. And this is a collection of essays. Annette Gordon Reed is a historian. Her specific time period is American history, I believe. I can't remember exactly what her area of scholarship is, but it's early American history. And so there's like 5 or 6 essays in this collection where she's specifically talking about the state of Texas and how Texas came to be a part of the United States and the intersection of that entity, Texas, and slavery, and how that worked, how basically Texas was founded in order to provide a place for slavery to continue to exist, and how that movement was wrapped up in the formation of Texas, but how in our American consciousness, Texas is really like cowboys and ranchers, right? Without addressing the history of slavery in that particular geographical place. And Annette Gordon Reed is from Texas. She grew up in Texas and she loves Texas. And so it was really fascinating to read from her perspective as a Black American growing up in a place like Texas. Her reflection about the history of that place and the more modern efforts for civil rights and, equality, desegregation, all that sort of thing. I thought this was really excellent. I was really pleased to read it on Juneteenth. I thought it was a great way to acknowledge that holiday and to educate myself further on what it means, because I'm from the state of Maine and Juneteenth was not something I ever had on my radar growing up. It was not a holiday that we celebrated in my state. It is now, as of last year, it has been made a state holiday. So that's good. At least there is some recognition of it as a Juneteenth, of course, being the day in which Black Americans were told they were no longer enslaved. Like finally, 2 years after the fact, they were given the official notification that slavery had ended. So yeah, I would highly recommend On Juneteenth, and it's a very slim little book, so you can read it in one day, which is what I did. And then I did finish a reread of Kushiel's Avatar on audiobook, and this is the third book in a epic fantasy trilogy. And I would just say, I don't want to talk about it too much because it is the third book in a fantasy trilogy, and so it would therefore spoil. It is the story of Phaedra, who is basically the most celebrated courtesan in this particular world, and she is also like a spy. She's really politically adept. She's really excellent at like figuring out complicated political issues and like hunting down information that's needed, hunting down people that are missing, like all these things. She's very adept at all these things. And the world building is really fascinating. It's sort of medieval France, Spain, Italy, Europe in general. There's, in this later book, it's like historical Africa gets brought into play. It's highly violent. There is a lot of graphic sex and graphic violence on the page, so just be aware of that if that's not something you're interested in. But it is also a fantasy trilogy that centers women and female experience. Our main character is a woman. She's bisexual, so that's really interesting. There are a lot of same-sex relationships in the book as a whole that play out over the course of the trilogy. So if that's something that you like in your fantasy, I definitely would recommend it. It's very, very like lush and detailed, and lots of political machinations. So if that's the kind of thing that you like, I would highly recommend it. It was awesome on audiobook. I would highly recommend it on audiobook. And I have forgotten the narrator of those audiobooks, and so I will put the audiobook narrator's name on the screen so you can see that. And yeah, give it a try. Kushiel's Dart is the first book in the trilogy if you're looking to start it. And then I'm looking down at my list, if you're wondering. The last book I want to talk about is yet another buddy read from the month of June. This is Cat's Eye by Margaret Atwood. This is a book off my ancient TBR, so yay for finally reading another book off the ancient TBR. I buddy read this with Sandy from Miss Reads a Lot, and it is a chunky monkey. It is over 400 books, so if you're looking for a book for Big Book Summer, this one definitely fits the bill. And I really loved this book. I had no idea what this book was about before I went into it. I just knew it was Margaret Atwood. And again, this is a female-centered book. This is all about female relationships. It is a coming-of-age story. Our main character, Elaine, we're basically following her story throughout her life from young childhood all the way to like middle age. In Canada, she is an artist, and she grew up in the Toronto area, and she currently, as an adult, lives in like the Vancouver area. So we go back. She was born like pre-World War II and grew up during the 50s and 60s, and so it's a lot about what roles were expected of women at that time. Her parents were kind of not counterculture, but they were non-traditional parents. Her dad was like a research scientist, and so they would spend summers out in the field, out in the forest, doing his science work. And her mom, while she was a stay-at-home mom, was very non-traditional for a 50s housewife and mother. She didn't wear dresses, and she was not like super focused on housework or anything like that. She had her own interests. And that is reflected in how she chose to raise her children. And so Elaine, is coming up as this non-traditional lifestyle, gets to be school age, and her parents finally say, okay, we gotta get a little bit more conformist and settle down, and our kid has to go to school. So she starts school, and she develops these female friendships, and it's all about what those friendships mean to her throughout her life, and how they impact how she sees the world, how she moves through the world, what she ends up doing. Sorry, just kicked the camera. What she ends up doing with her life. And these female friendships reverberate throughout her life. And it was fascinating. She ends up, like I said, becoming an artist, and even her art is reflective of these female friendships. And how she viewed not only her peer group, her age group of girls, but how she viewed the mothers in her life, like the female figures that were supposed to be role models, the other mothers, the mothers of her friends, the female teachers, and how all of that impacted her view of the world and her role in it, and what it was to be a woman. I found it fascinating. I found it incredibly relatable. Not only middle-aged Elaine, but young girl Elaine, and the struggles and the awful incidents that she goes through with these female relationships. There was a lot to relate to. And so Sandy and I had some fun conversations about what we thought about the different things that were happening in this book. So yeah, this is only second to The Handmaid's Tale for me in terms of the books that I've read in Margaret Atwood's catalog. I think this is an amazing book. I don't hear it talked about as much as some of her other titles. And I think if you're looking for a book about female relationships and what it's like to be a woman in the world, especially in mid-20th century Canada, I think, highly, highly relatable and interesting and fascinating. And yeah, I love this book. And it's even for a thick book, it's a quick read, because It's very short chapters, and you just fly through them. You're like, oh, I'll just read another chapter. I'll just read another chapter. And so, yeah, don't be intimidated by the size of this book. It's very, very readable. So yeah, those are the books that I've read recently. Have you read any of these? Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of them. If you have, I hope you're all doing well and finding some great books to read, and I will talk to you later.